just a repeat from several years ago. If you're like me, you probably won't remember. It's been 5 or 6 years, I guess, since we looked at this subject. Today we're going to look at is Jesus, friend of sinners. And I'm glad he is a friend of sinners. If he had not been a friend of sinners, he wouldn't have came to me, he wouldn't have saved me, because I was a sinner. All of us were sinners. And I'm glad he is a sinner. That's what we're going to talk about today. In these first few verses, I'm going to read here in Luke chapter number 5, the reason Jesus came to this earth was for sinners. So let me begin reading here. I'm going to be reading a lot. You're welcome to turn. You don't have to, but be turning to a lot of different passages today and reading more so than normal today. But I'll start here, Luke chapter 5. Let me begin in verse number 27. It says, "And after these things he went forth," of course talking about Jesus, "and saw a publican named Levi sitting at the receipt of custom, and said unto him, Follow me. And he left all, rose up, and followed him. And Levi made him a great feast in his own house, and there was a great company of publicans and of all others that sat down with them. But their scribes and Pharisees murmured against his disciples, saying, Why do you eat and drink with publicans and sinners? And Jesus answering and said unto them, They that are whole need not a physician, but they that are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." So again, I've already said that's the reason Jesus came to this earth is for sinners. Not for the righteous, but he came for sinners. Turn over a couple pages since you're already this close to Luke chapter 7. Read a few more verses here, and then we'll start talking about some individual instances about Jesus being a friend of sinners. But Luke chapter 7, verse verse 31 through 35. Let me read you these verses, make a couple comments, and then we'll go forward. Of course, here Jesus had been talking to the Pharisees and had been explaining to them about John's ministry. He had also been raising the dead, healing the sick, casting out demons, prior to what he's about to say here in these verses. In verse 31 here, Luke chapter number 7, Jesus and the Lord said, Whereunto then shall I liken the men of this generation, and to what are they like? They are like unto children sitting in the marketplace and calling one to another, saying, We have piped unto you, and ye have not danced. We have mourned to you, and ye have not wept. For John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking wine, and ye say, He hath a devil. The Son of Man is come eating and drinking, and ye say, Behold, a gluttonous man, and a winebibber, a friend of publicans and sinners. But wisdom is justified of all her children." So again, he's talking to the Pharisees here. And these are some of the things here the Pharisees and the lawyers had to say about John and also about Jesus. Verse number 33, they said, Well, John, he hath a devil. Again, these are the Pharisees and lawyers saying these things here. And then about Jesus, said verse 34 says he's a gluttonous man. That we all know that just means that somebody just eats a lot, just overeats. Also says he's a winebibber. That's just somebody that drinks a lot, or maybe an alcoholic, as we would know today. Also says he's a friend of publicans. Publicans, we know in the New Testament, is just a tax collector. And that's what Matthew was in the previous verses we just read. But it also says here, they said he's also a friend of sinners. And you may have heard the argument through the years that, well, this friend of sinners part can't be right or can't be true because the gluttonous and the winebibber part, of course, we know were not true. You say, well, how can some statements be true, some statements be false, especially in the same verse? Well, that's easy because there are no scriptures whatsoever to back up what the Pharisees said here about Jesus being a gluttonous man or being a winebibber. There's no scriptures to back that up whatsoever. But there are plenty of scriptures to back up the second part of what they said about how he's a friend of publicans and that he's a friend of sinners. So that's what we want to look at today, some examples of how Jesus was truly friends of sinners. First one we want to look at is here still in Luke chapter number 7. You don't even have to turn. The next verse, verse 36. We're going to look at a loving sinner that Jesus was a friend to. Luke chapter 7, verse 36. And one of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner. when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointment, and stood at his feet behind him weeping, and began to wash his feet with the tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now when the Pharisee, which had bidden him, saw it, he spake within himself, saying, This man, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is what? A sinner. And Jesus answering said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he says, Master, say on. There was a certain creditor which had 2 debtors. The one owed 500 pence and the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me therefore, which of them will love him most? Simon answered and said, I suppose that he to whom he forgave most. And he said unto him, Thou hast rightly judged. And he turned to the woman and said unto Simon, notice, he wasn't talking to the woman here. He said he turned to the woman, but he was talking to Simon, not Simon Peter, Simon the Pharisee, whose house he was in. He says, Seest thou this woman? I entered into thine house. Thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with tears, and wiped them with the hairs of her head. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins which are many are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loveth little. And he said unto her, Thy sins are forgiven. And they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, Who is this that forgiveth sins also? And he said unto the woman, Thy faith hath saved thee. Go in peace. So we say Jesus was a friend of this, we'll call her a loving sinner, because she was a loving sinner, right? She was a sinner, but she was loving the Lord. And notice that he told Simon here, this Pharisee, whose house he was in, verses 44, 45, and 46, he said, Simon, you didn't do anything for me. When I came in, you had the same opportunities she did, but you didn't do anything for me. And look at all these things that this woman had done for me. So I'm glad Jesus, he was a friend of this sinner, this loving sinner. Let's look at another one. Let's look at a Samaritan sinner. John chapter 4. We all know the story of the woman at the well. I'm going to take time to read this entire chapter just for time's sake. Just pick out a few verses here and read. So this is a Samaritan sinner here that Jesus was a friend to. John chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. Excuse me. When therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself baptized not but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. And he must needs go through Samaria. Skip down to verse 7. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. For the disciples were gone away into the city to buy meat. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. And Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that said to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldst ask of him, and he would have given thee living water. Skip down to verse 25. The woman saith unto him, I know that Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. Jesus said unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. And upon this came his disciples, and marveled that he talked with a woman, yet no man said, Why seekest thou, or why talkest thou to her? The woman then left her water pot, and went to the city, and saith unto men, Come see a man, which told me all things that ever I did. Is not this the Christ? A few more verses. Skip down to verse 39. And many of the Samaritans of the city believed on him for the saying of the woman, which testified, I told you all that ever I did. So when the Samaritans were come unto him, they besought him that he would tarry with them, and he abode there 2 days. And many more believed because of his own word. And he said unto the woman, Now we believe, not because of thy saying, for we have heard him ourselves, and know that this is indeed the Christ, the Savior of the world. So notice back in verse number 29, after Jesus had talked to this Samaritan sinner, we know she was a sinner, she was a Samaritan. We know the Jews didn't have no dealings because the Samaritans, they were half Jews, half Gentiles. That's why they didn't have any dealings with them. But yet Jesus did. He was a friend of this Samaritan sinner. Verse 29, she says, Is not this the Christ? I mean, he's told me everything that ever I did. Is not this the Christ, the Messiah that's been prophesied would come? So I'm glad Jesus was a friend to this Samaritan sinner. What about, let's look at another one. What about an adulterous sinner? John chapter 8. We know the story here of the woman taken in the very act of adultery. John chapter 8, verse number 1. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again to the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and the Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, but what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down, and with his finger wrote on the ground, as though he heard them not. Now when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself, and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And he began to stoop down, and wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. So Jesus was a friend even to an adulterous sinner. And these Pharisees, they brought her to Jesus. They were just trying to trick Jesus. That was their only motive, was to try to trick Jesus. But notice verse 7, 8, and 9, everybody that was in attendance had sinned, right? It says, Jesus said, if nobody has sinned, all right, you have every right, go ahead and stone her. But everybody was a sinner themselves. He said, so everybody left. Everybody left except Jesus and the woman. And notice not only he said here he was a friend to her, but the last phrase here in verse number 11, he says, Neither do I condemn thee. He says, just go and sin no more. So Jesus was a friend here to this adulterous sinner. Again, he's a friend to everybody. Look at another one. What about, let's look at a rich sinner. We know the story of Zacchaeus over in Luke chapter number 19. Glad Jesus is a friend to rich sinners, poor sinners. We've seen some already, but he's a friend to rich sinners as well. Luke chapter 19, verse number 1. And Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, which was a chief among the publicans, and he was rich. And he sought to see Jesus who he was, and could not for the press, because he was of little stature. And he ran before and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. And when Jesus came to that place, he looked up and saw him and said, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. And he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all murmured, saying that he was going to be a guest with a man that is what? A sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said unto the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I restore him fourfold. And Jesus said unto him, This day is salvation come to this house, for as much as he also is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost. Again, why did Jesus come into the world? Because of sinners. He came to seek and save the sinners, those that are lost, not the righteous, but he came to save the lost. Notice here in verse number 9, what he tells Zacchaeus, he said, salvation is come to this house. So Zacchaeus here, he got saved. So Jesus was a friend to a rich man as well. Look at another example. What about a religious sinner? He was a friend to, we've already seen, he was friends to adulterous sinners, poor sinners, rich sinners. Well, he was also a friend to a religious sinner. Nicodemus, John chapter number 3. Just going to read a few verses here. Not going to take time to read the entire chapter, but we know the story here of Nicodemus, how he came to Jesus by night. So he was Nicodemus. He was a religious man. He was a Pharisee. He was probably even part of the Sanhedrin back in the day. So he was a religious man, but he was a religious sinner. John chapter 3, verse 1 through 3. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. The same came to Jesus by night, and said unto him, Rabbi, we know that thou art a teacher come from God, for no man can do these miracles that thou doest, except God be with him. And Jesus answered and said unto him, Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And we know the rest of the story, how Jesus presented the gospel to him and talked about how the wind and stuff, and how the wind blows, and you can't see it, but you can tell where it goes, things like that. And he explained salvation here to Nicodemus. Now, I believe Nicodemus got saved. We're not told here. In John chapter 3, we're not told at all whether he did or not. So how do we know if he got saved? Well, I think we've got a pretty good example, some good evidence. John chapter 7, we see where Nicodemus, he defended Jesus. It says in John 7, verse 45, then came the officers to the chief priests and Pharisees, and they said unto him, why have you not brought him? Because remember, they had sent him to get Jesus, but they didn't bring him back. Because the officers answered, never man spake like this man. Then answered them the Pharisees, are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers or of the Pharisees believed on him? But this people who knoweth not the law are cursed. Nicodemus saith unto him, and notice here, it was specifically which Nicodemus it was. It says, he that came to Jesus by night, being one of them, he says, doth our law judge any man before it hear him, and know what he doeth? So he was defending Jesus here in this particular case. Another good example, I believe Nicodemus got saved. John chapter number 19, he helped with Jesus' body after Jesus was crucified, and they took him off the cross. And after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him leave. He came therefore and took the body of Jesus. And there came also Nicodemus. Which Nicodemus? It says, which at the first came to Jesus by night. So again, it's specific on who this Nicodemus was in both of these passages. It says, and he brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100-pound weight. Then took they the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as the manner of the Jews is to bury. So these are pretty good evidences here that Nicodemus got saved. Don't know if he got saved here in John chapter 3 or later on, but Nicodemus got saved. So Jesus was a friend even to a religious sinner. So we've seen some examples here, how he was a friend to a loving sinner, a Samaritan sinner, an adulterous sinner, a rich sinner, even a religious sinner. So Jesus was a friend to all these types of sinners, and those are mainly salvation examples, how he came and he saved those particular type sinners. Look at a few more examples here of some healing examples as well as salvation, because all these people here that got healed that we're going to talk about, Jesus saved them as well. Let's look how Jesus was a friend to a blind sinner, Bartimaeus, back over in Luke chapter number 18. I'll read a few verses over there. Jesus was a friend to a blind sinner. Luke chapter 18, verse number 35. And it came to pass that as he was come nigh to Jericho, a certain blind man sat by the wayside begging, and hearing the multitude pass by, he asked what it meant, and they told him that Jesus of Nazareth passed by. And he cried, saying, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me. And they which went before rebuked him, that he should hold his peace. But he cried so much the more, Thou son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stood and commanded him to be brought unto him. And when he was come near, he asked him, saying, What will that I should do unto thee? And he said, Lord, that I might receive my sight. And Jesus said unto him, Receive thy sight. Thy faith has saved thee. And immediately he received his sight and followed him, glorifying God. And all the people, when they saw it, gave praise unto God. Now, Luke here doesn't name this particular blind man, but if you go over to Mark chapter number 10, you see that this is exactly who this was. In Mark's gospel, he names him. Mark 10, verse 46, and they came to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho with his disciples, a great number of people, blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the highway side, begging. So this was definitely blind Bartimaeus. So Jesus was a friend to this blind sinner. But not only did he heal him, we see that clearly here, but he saved him. Notice verse number 42. He says, Jesus said, Receive thy sight. He healed him. He says, Thy faith has saved thee. So Jesus was a friend to this blind sinner by healing him and also by saving him. What about, so that's a blind sinner. Jesus was a friend to a blind sinner. What about a lame sinner? John chapter number 5. We all know the story where the impotent man was there at the pool of Bethesda for 38 years. And we know how Jesus was a friend to him as well. John chapter 5, verse number 1. And there was a feast of the Jews. And Jesus went to Jerusalem. And there was at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is in Hebrew tongue called Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down in a certain season into the pool, troubled the water. Whosoever then first, at the troubling of the water, stepped in was made whole, and whatsoever disease he had. And a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lie, and knew that he had been now a long time in that case, he said, Wilt thou be made whole? The impotent man answered and said, Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Jesus said unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed, and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. The Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath day, it is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. He answered him and said, He that made me whole, the same said unto me, Take up thy bed and walk. Then asked they him, What man is that which said unto thee, Take up thy bed and walk? And he that was healed wist not who it was, for Jesus had convened himself away, a multitude being in that place. Afterward, Jesus findeth him in the temple and said, Behold, thou art made whole. Sin no more, lest the worst thing come unto thee. So Jesus was a friend to this lame man, this impotent man, been there for 38 years. But not only we know he healed him, we just read that, but he also saved him. In verse 14, he says, You're made whole. He said, but sin no more. So Jesus was a friend to this lame man. So we see he's a friend of this blind man. He was a friend of this lame man, this lame sinner. We see he's also a friend to a sick sinner. Multiple examples we can find in the scriptures about that. But Luke chapter 5 is the one I want to read today. Luke chapter 5, verse number 17. We know this is a story where these 4 men brought this man to Jesus, and they couldn't get in, so they took off parts of the roof and let him down. Let me read a few verses here. Luke chapter 5, verse 17. It came to pass on a certain day, as he was teaching, that there were Pharisees and doctors of the law sitting by, which were come out of every town of Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was present to heal them. And behold, men brought in a man, in a bed a man, which was taken with palsy. And they sought means to bring him in and to lay him before him. And when they could not find by what way they might bring him in because of the multitude, they went to the housetop and let him down through the tiling with his couch into the midst before Jesus. And when he saw their faith, he said unto them, Man, thy sins are forgiven thee. And the scribes and Pharisees began to reason, saying, Who is this that speaketh blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? And when Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answered and said unto them, What reason ye in your hearts, whether it is easier to say, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, Rise up and walk. But you may know that the Son of Man hath power upon earth to forgive sins. He said to the sick of the palsy, I say unto thee, Arise, take up thy couch, and go into thy house. And immediately he arose before them, took up that whereon he lay, and departed in his own house, glorifying God. So Jesus here, he was a friend to this sick sinner. Right. We know he healed him. We see that clearly. But he also saved him. Verse number 20 says, Man, thy sins are forgiven thee. So I'm glad Jesus is a friend to all these sinners. We saw he's a friend here to a blind sinner, a lame sinner, a sick sinner. We've already talked about how he was a friend to a loving sinner, a Samaritan sinner. He was a friend to an adulterous sinner, a rich sinner, even the religious sinner we talked about, Nicodemus. So I'm glad Jesus is a friend to all these different types of sinners. So we've seen some salvation examples. We've seen some healing and salvation examples. What about maybe some compassion examples? What about some hungry sinners? Matthew chapter number 14. We see that Jesus had compassion here on some hungry sinners. This is, of course, the story where the 5,000 were fed. Matthew chapter number 14, beginning in verse number 13. When Jesus heard of it, he departed thence by ship into a desert place apart. And when the people had heard thereof, they followed him on foot and out of the cities. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude, and was moved with compassion toward them, and he healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, This is a desert place, and the time is now past. Send the multitude away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves victuals. But Jesus said unto them, They need not depart, give ye them to eat. And they said unto him, We have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. He said, Bring them hither to me. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples to the multitude. And they did all eat and were filled. And they took up the fragments that remained, 12 baskets full. And they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So notice verse number 14 says, Jesus, he had compassion on these sinners. And these were hungry sinners. Right. I mean, they hadn't eaten in a long time. And so Jesus had compassion. He loved. Jesus was a friend to these hungry sinners as well. What about some confused sinners? Just back over a few pages to Matthew chapter number 9. We see here this scattered multitude. In Matthew chapter 9, beginning in verse number 35, excuse me, it says, And Jesus went into all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. Notice verse 36, so it says, But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion. Again, we're talking about some compassion examples here. It says, He was moved with compassion on them because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. Then saith he unto the disciples, The harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers into his harvest. So verse 36, it says they were scattered like a sheep that had no shepherd. So these were, we'll call them confused sinners. Right. Well, Jesus was a friend to these confused sinners today. And you know, we see there's so many people today that we talk to, we come in contact with. They're confused. You know, they're just confused. And so, but Jesus was a friend to those sinners, just the same as he was to all these others we talked about. And also verse 37 here, he even told his disciples, this was back when Jesus was walking on the earth. He says the harvest is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Even back in Jesus' day, he said that. Well, how much more today is that true? And you know, we had visitation yesterday, and for those that were here in this class, I commend those for coming, because we had a good crowd yesterday. I think we had 9 here yesterday, and that was a good crowd compared to what we've had the last year or so. We usually had 4 or 5. So we had a good crowd, and Scott and I went together, and we went over here to this subdivision, and we only got about 1/4 of it, I guess, if that much. So Lord willing, maybe next time we'll get some more. But we ran across some confused sinners yesterday on visitation. A lot of confused sinners out here, but Jesus is still a friend to those sinners as well. Probably got time maybe for one more. Look in Matthew chapter number 19, and we'll call this sinner a non-receptive sinner. This is a story, of course, about the rich young ruler that came to Jesus. Matthew chapter 19, begin verse number 16. And behold, one came and said unto him, Good master, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life? And he said unto him, Why callest thou me good? There is none good but one, that is God. But if thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments. And he said unto him, Which? Jesus said, Thou shalt do no murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, honor thy father and thy mother, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The young man said unto him, All these things have I kept from my youth up, which lack I yet? And Jesus said unto him, If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven. Come and follow me. But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. So this young man, he came to Jesus, and he was looking for something, but when he found out he had to follow Jesus, he didn't want to do that. So he was not really receptive to what Jesus told him to do, but Jesus was still a friend of this sinner anyway. Even non-receptive sinners that don't hear and won't listen, Jesus is still a friend of them. And we're about out of time here. We won't take time to read this one, but what about murderous sinners? We know the story when Jesus was crucified, right? In all the Gospels, we have the story of that. But what did Jesus say? He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So these people murdered Jesus, had Jesus killed. But Jesus was a friend. He was still even a friend to these sinners. And we won't take time to read this one. Our time's up, but I was going to have one more. What about even demonic sinners? Yes. Jesus was a friend of them. We know the story of the maniac of Gadara, probably the most infamous story we have about Jesus casting out a devil. Jesus was a friend to him. So many other examples we have in the Word of God. How Jesus is a friend of sinners. I was going to take time to read a song here. I won't. Some of you may know it by Casting Crowns. Jesus, Friend of Sinners. It's several years old. A good song there. A lot of good words in it. And that song, won't take time to read it. But I do want to finish here with a quote that I saw. It says that Christians are not called to serve the world that they wish existed, but the world that is. You know, and yeah, we wish that the world wasn't like it is today, with all the crazy things that are going on today, especially today, with this homosexuality, transgenderism, all this nonsense that's going on. We wish the world wasn't that way, but it doesn't matter. That's the world that we live in today, and that's the world that we have to reach. That's the world that Jesus is a friend of. So, Jesus was a friend of sinners. Are we going to be a friend of sinners? You know what? Mordecai, remember what he told Esther? In Esther 4:14, he says, "You are here for such a time as this." So this is the day that we live in today. Exactly. Whether we like this wicked world or not, it's what we live in. Right. And we've got to love them, we've got to reach them, and we've got to be a friend to them, just like Jesus was. Exactly.